Today we begin our discussion with French Baroque and Rococo. I'm Dr. Rose, and as you know, we have been covering many important topics in Western art. Today we have an interesting dialogue. We're going to start by exploring many important people in these two areas. You need to know these people because they play a very, very important part in these two areas of Western art. One is French Baroque. So let's start there. Louis XIV. So we're going to explore the home of Louis XIV, his ways of life, his art, and etc. So I think you'll find it very, very interesting. We'll also look at some pieces from Nicolas Poussin as well as Claude Lorraine. Then we will move to Rococo. Rococo key individuals are Antoine Watteau, Francois Boucher, and Jean-Honoré Fragonard. So make sure you go to the slide entitled French Baroque and Rococo, and there you will see the names of these individuals. So let's begin with a bust. This bust by Bernini, 1665. It is a bust of Louis XIV, and it is French Baroque. So let's begin with what is a bust. So the bust is a statue that is basically from the waist up. So if we look at this very carefully, what we see are the curly curls of Louis XIV's hair. How is this accomplished? This is accomplished with contour. So this is a very interesting piece because clearly we're looking at stone, but yet from that stone we get this beautiful texture that makes his hair look soft. If we go down from there, we can see his attire, the flowing contour to give us the sense of fabric. He also has a lace design around his neck for his shirt. So this is a very, very fancy piece, and hence we are looking at a period of time in which these kinds of pieces were referred to as French Baroque. So let's talk a little bit about Louis XIV. This is a portrait of him. So he adopted the name Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. He believed that he was the center of the universe, and it was God's will that he be king. He kept complete control of France and his followers, and he founded the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 1648. And the purpose of this was to promote the French classical style. He invented the red heel shoes due to being only 5 feet 4 inches. So let's take a moment to look at his attire. First, we can see that he is draped in a fabric in this portrait. This portrait was done in 1701. So we can see the draping, and that contour was used to create that draping. He is wearing stockings, so white colors are used to create that. And his shoes have the red heels. This was to make him appear taller. A diagonal line is used to create his cane, and we could see that black is used for his curly tendrils of hair. Behind him, we see a red silk curtain with gold tassels. So this is all extremely elegant and extremely fancy, and some would say that it's a bit over the top, but this was the style of Louis XIV. So let's learn about his life because it's so interesting. In his court, there was what is known as court etiquette. Life at the court was narrowly regulated by court etiquette. Etiquette became the means of social advancement for the court. Louis XIV's elaborate rules of etiquette included the following. People who wanted to speak to the king could not knock on his door. Normally, we're accustomed to knocking on the door if we want to speak to someone. Instead, using the left pinky finger, they had to gently scratch on the door until they were granted permission to enter. As a result, many courtiers grew that fingernail longer than the others. Why? Because when they went to his room and scratched on the door, that was the way they may or may not have been granted permission to come in. A lady never held hands or linked arms with a gentleman. Besides being in bad taste, this practice would have been impossible because a woman's hooped skirts, think of these big, wide skirts, were so wide that it was impossible for her to actually hold hands with the gentleman next to her. Instead, she was to place her hands on top of the gentleman's bent arm as they strolled through the gardens and chambers of Versailles. We're going to look at Versailles in a little bit because this is the palace that still stands today, by the way, that Louis XIV and his court resided. It is also mentioned that the ladies were only allowed to touch fingertips with the men, so no holding hands whatsoever. When a gentleman sat down, he slid his left foot in front of the other, placed the hands on the sides of the chair, and gently lowered himself into the chair. There was a very practical reason for this procedure. If a gentleman sat too fast, his tight trousers might split. Women and men were not allowed to cross their legs in public. When a gentleman passed an acquaintance on the street, he was to raise his hat high off of his head until the other person passed. A gentleman was to do no work except writing letters, giving speeches, practicing fencing, or dancing. For pleasure, he engaged in hawking archery, indoor tennis, or hunting. A gentleman would also take part in battle and would sometimes serve as a public officer, paying the soldiers. So let's go over this again. Not all of the details, but just the notions that are presented here. This is court etiquette, meaning that there were rules of etiquette that everyone had to follow in regard to the residence of Louis XIV in terms of his court. So he was very, very particular, and this all falls into this kind of meticulous behavior, falls into this category of French Baroque. So let's take a look at the Palace of Versailles, circa 1680, the home of Louis XIV. Now, I personally have had a chance to visit Versailles because Versailles is located in Paris, France. So if you ever find yourself in that location, this is a must-do. Look at the detail. Let's start with the outside. You can see all of the intricate detail. We can see what appears to be balconies on the top with windows. There's a clock in the center. There's gold on the building. There's windows with arches. And it's a very, very huge place. And it's beautiful beyond measure. So we want to pay attention to the details of it, though, because beyond it being beautiful, it represents this style, which is known as Baroque. So now we are looking at a painting of Versailles. This painting is from 1722. So let's look at some of the classical understandings or formal terms that we have to describe this place. First of all, there is perspective. So if we look in the forefront of the image, we can see that there are people and horses and activity taking place. And then we see the entrance. Notice that there is symmetry. So if we look at the door that is directly in the middle and then both sides, we see that there is symmetry just from this perspective. And then as you enter, you continue to see this symmetry that exists on both sides. This is an absolutely beautiful painting. The perspective continues almost as if this is a 3D image going all the way to the back to the mountains that we see in the background. The sky has a white and a pink tinge, which is very lovely, and we can see hints of orange throughout this entire painting. So it is absolutely a wonderful piece that is exhibiting this style called French Baroque. So it's a very enjoyable painting, not because of the history and the understanding of this location, but because the painting itself is so well done, so detailed, so intricate, that in a way you can almost imagine yourself actually being there. So here we see a photo, an aerial view. And in the aerial view, you get the same sense. So beginning at the front or the forefront of the image, you can see the opening. And then note the symmetry. Very, very important, going all the way back to the water that we see in the background. The symmetry continues. It was designed in this way. Note all the trees on either side. So we begin with the buildings, and we can see symmetry in terms of the buildings. And then if you continue to go back, we run into the natural aspect, which includes all of the beautiful trees, and there's gardens. So on just directly besides the buildings or behind the buildings, on either side, you see these beautiful gardens. So you are looking at, I want you to recognize which slides I am referring to. So the first slide that I referred to was the painting of Versailles from 1722. Look at that very, very carefully, and then go to the next slide and look at the photo. And you can see the difference in the images, but all that I'm pointing out is present in both. So next we go into the Hall of Mirrors. Versailles, still we're now inside of that facility that I was just showing you. And this is circa 1680. So decadent, so incredibly fancy. So first, let's note the symmetry. So if your eyes will look directly through the door at the end, you will see a light shining on the floor. This is the Hall of Mirrors. On each side, there is symmetry. And we see mirrors and gold and chandeliers, and don't forget to look up. So when you are in these types of Baroque style locations, it's important to look up because there is very, very extravagant art on the ceilings. Also note the floors. The floors have squares, but they are placed in a diamond shape to give them a very, very fancy appearance, as well as the gold that we see throughout on either side. So this decadence, this beauty, this over-the-top, this Louis XIV style, this is Baroque. So again, here, note the columns. We are now inside of the chapel, which is in Versailles. The ceiling is adorned absolutely beautifully. We see columns and pillars, arches, all kinds of beauty. The light is shining through the windows just right because they were designed for that. So everything about this room is just elegance, but again, a little bit over the top. Here we see another wonderful room, which is the Hall of Battles of Versailles. So note the symmetry, the same distance from the doors on each side with the columns and the pillars. It's absolutely wonderful. Looking up, we see the light shining through the ceiling, the tinges of orange, the paintings, all of it is wonderful. So we are going to take a bit more of a look at Versailles in our next video. Thank you.